Welcome to the Nightmare Vault. Before we start, drop a hello in the comments, and if you haven't already, please like and subscribe. Let's begin. The endless horizon of the Scottish Highlands still haunts me, not for its beauty, but for how effectively it isolated us from everything I once took for granted. Safety, connection, witnesses. I find myself tensing whenever I see a camper van now, my heart rate accelerating at the distinctive shape of an RV against the skyline. These normal vehicles, symbols of freedom and adventure for most, represent something entirely different in my fractured memory. Mobile prisons moving between remote locations, carrying occupants who had no idea they were being filmed for their final moments as dark web entertainment. Before that week in May, I was just another burnt-out university graduate with a photography degree and mounting debt, bouncing between freelance gigs, while my more successful classmates secured gallery showings and stable positions. My portfolio was technically sound, but lacked what one particularly blunt interviewer called authentic emotional content, the kind that comes from genuine human connection rather than staged compositions. When I stumbled across a posting on a photography forum seeking someone to document a Highland road trip for a travel blog, the opportunity seemed almost too perfect. 2 weeks of accommodations and meals covered, plus a modest day rate, and the chance to build my portfolio with breathtaking landscapes. The 3 people who picked me up outside Inverness Station didn't immediately trigger any internal alarms. Marcus, the apparent leader, was a charismatic American in his 30s, with an easy smile and impressive knowledge of high-end camera equipment. Sasha, a quiet woman with a Scandinavian accent who handled most of the driving, kept her interactions brief but professional. Then there was Eli, younger than the others, constantly fidgeting with various devices, phones, tablets, a sophisticated laptop setup, who explained his role as handling their social media presence and technical needs. The camper van itself was surprisingly luxurious. A large, well-appointed vehicle with distinct living and sleeping areas, modern appliances, and what I initially registered as impressively comprehensive camera equipment for a travel blog. Looking back, I should have questioned why a simple travel documentary required multiple hidden cameras, encrypted hard drives, and satellite uplink capability disguised as standard communication equipment. I mistook these red flags for signs of professionalism, of serious content creators investing in quality production. The truth was far darker. They had created a mobile studio designed for filming isolated locations while broadcasting to paying audiences hidden in obscure corners of the internet. Our first 3 days followed a seemingly legitimate pattern. We visited spectacular viewpoints along the North Coast 500 route, capturing footage of ancient castles and dramatic cliffs. I handled most of the still photography, while Marcus directed video sequences that seemed, at the time, like standard travel content. The only odd element was their insistence on incorporating hitchhikers or solo travelers we encountered into our footage. They were particularly interested in backpackers, young people traveling alone, often foreign visitors with limited connections in the country. Each evening, we would park in increasingly remote locations, far from official campsites or other travelers. Marcus explained this as seeking unspoiled shots, an authentic wilderness experience, which aligned with the blog's supposed focus on off-grid travel. During these nights, Eli would spend hours hunched over his equipment in what they called the editing bay, a partitioned section of the camper with multiple screens and a door that locked from the inside. I occasionally caught fragments of his communication, that didn't quite fit our supposed project. References to subscribers, premium content, and special requests. The first truly unsettling incident occurred on our fourth night. We had picked up a backpacker earlier that day, a German student hiking through Scotland on his gap year. He seemed thrilled by the offer of a hot meal and lift to the next town. That evening, parked beside a remote loch with no other vehicles visible for miles, I woke to hushed movements and the distinct sound of a struggle coming from the main cabin area. Peering through a crack in my curtained sleeping compartment, I glimpsed Marcus and Sasha restraining the German traveler, while Eli adjusted camera angles and lighting with practiced efficiency. My immediate reaction was frozen disbelief. Surely this was some misunderstanding, perhaps an elaborate prank for their blog. I retreated into my bunk, heartbeat thundering in my ears, trying to rationalize what I'd seen. By morning, the backpacker was gone, with Marcus casually mentioning that he decided to continue his journey early. The easy way he maintained eye contact while delivering this obvious lie sent ice through my veins, but I nodded and forced a smile, suddenly aware of my own vulnerability in this isolated location with people who were clearly not who they claimed to be. That day, reviewing images on my camera, I noticed something I'd overlooked. A folder accidentally synced from Eli's computer to our shared cloud storage. Inside were thumbnails that made my blood run cold. Night vision footage of previous guests in various stages of terror, file names containing phrases like unboxing, first cut, and finale. Most disturbing was a document listing dark web viewer statistics and cryptocurrency payments associated with each video, some figures reaching 5 and 6 digits for what were labeled interactive eliminations. The file structure used the same distinctive formatting I'd only read about in articles exposing dark web marketplaces and red rooms. The horrifying truth crystallized all at once. I wasn't documenting a travel blog. I was unknowingly participating in a dark web broadcast channel that streamed kidnapping, torture, and murder to paying viewers who could influence the proceedings through cryptocurrency donations and votes. The remote locations weren't for capturing unspoiled landscapes. They were chosen for isolation, for eliminating the possibility of intervention or witnesses. This was one of those infamous dark web red rooms I'd heard journalists reference with skepticism, operating right before my eyes. And I, with my legitimate photography credentials and the social media presence, provided the perfect cover for approaching victims and establishing trust. That night, parked in our most isolated location yet beside an abandoned quarry, I overheard them discussing their plans for me. I had served my purpose in helping secure victims and providing authentic-looking content for their cover story. Now, according to Marcus, I would make compelling final content for their premium subscribers. Eli mentioned special requests already coming in, viewers excited by the prospect of the documentarian becoming the documented. Sasha, in her clinical tone, suggested a multi-day experience to maximize revenue. My only chance was the brief window when they all left the camper to scout the location for optimal filming angles. With shaking hands, I searched frantically for anything I could use: cash, keys, a weapon for defense. What I found instead, hidden in a compartment beneath Eli's workstation, was a hard drive containing what appeared to be their complete broadcast history. Dozens of videos documenting what happened to the smiling, trusting travelers who had briefly appeared in our travel blog footage before disappearing. I grabbed the drive along with my own camera containing photographic evidence of locations and their faces, then slipped out through the emergency exit window. The Highland night was bitterly cold, the darkness nearly absolute away from the camper's lights. I oriented myself toward where I thought the nearest road might be, perhaps 5 miles across difficult terrain, and began moving as quietly as possible across the rocky landscape. I hadn't gone more than 100 yards when the camper's exterior lights suddenly flooded the area with harsh illumination. A notification tone had betrayed me. My phone, which I'd forgotten to silence, receiving a message from a friend checking why I hadn't posted on social media recently. The familiar ping echoed across the quarry like a death knell, immediately followed by shouts from Marcus, directing the others to different search quadrants. What followed was a nightmarish game of cat and mouse across terrain I was ill-equipped to navigate. I could hear them methodically sweeping the area, Eli providing updates through their communication system, Marcus occasionally calling out with false promises of safety if I returned willingly. Most chilling was Sasha's complete silence, professional, efficient, tracking me with the focus of someone who had done this many times before. I eventually found shelter in a narrow crevice between boulders, pressing myself into the damp darkness as their flashlight beams swept nearby. Hours passed, the cold seeping into my bones, before the first hints of dawn provided enough light to navigate. I emerged cautiously, limbs stiff and painful, to discover the camper still parked in the distance, but no sign of my pursuers. The road, when I finally reached it, was deserted at that early hour. I walked for nearly 3 hours before a delivery van stopped, the driver's initial wariness turning to concern at my disheveled state and obviously distressed condition. He drove me to the nearest police station in Ullapool, maintaining a respectful silence that I now recognize as the reaction of someone who senses they've encountered something traumatic and doesn't want to cause further harm through questioning. The police response was initially skeptical. My story sounded fantastical, especially without immediately available evidence. The hard drive I'd stolen was encrypted in ways beyond their immediate technical capabilities. It took the discovery of blood evidence in a location I'd photographed, matched to a missing Portuguese tourist reported 3 days earlier, for the investigation to gain momentum. By then, the camper and its occupants had vanished, likely across the border or out of the country entirely. 6 months later, international law enforcement identified Marcus and Eli operating a similar scheme in rural New Zealand, targeting hikers on remote trails. They were arrested during an attempted abduction, their equipment confiscated, the full horror of their dark web operation exposed. The investigation uncovered a complex network of Tor hidden services, cryptocurrency wallets, and subscriber lists spanning 5 continents. Sasha remains at large, her true identity still unknown despite multiple aliases documented across several countries and dark web marketplaces. The videos continue to circulate on the dark web, I'm told, pass between private servers and encrypted channels beyond the reach of conventional detection. Sometimes I wonder if the people who watched those broadcasts, who paid to vote on what happened to those travelers, who treated human suffering as interactive entertainment, ever reflect on their role in creating the demand that these monsters supplied. I wonder how many well-appointed camper vans are traveling remote roads right now, their occupants unaware that their journey is being broadcast to unseen audiences eagerly awaiting the moment when the friendly hosts reveal their true purpose. I no longer take photographs. I no longer travel to isolated locations. I no longer trust offers that seem too perfectly aligned with my needs. Most of all, I never forget that the real horrors in this world aren't supernatural monsters or fictional killers. They're the ordinary-looking people who see others not as human beings, but as content to be consumed. Their suffering translated into engagement metrics and cryptocurrency transactions somewhere in the darkest corners of the dark web. That shadowy underbelly of the internet continues to host these broadcasts, with new RVs and new victims, while most people remain blissfully unaware of what truly lurks beneath the surface of their everyday online experience. I remember the rain that night, not the soft, gentle kind that lulls you to sleep, but the harsh, unrelenting downpour that seems determined to wash away every trace of humanity from the streets. London had been suffering through 3 straight days of this biblical deluge, and I was desperate for a dry place with decent Wi-Fi after my flat's internet had gone down. That's how I found myself pushing through the door of Night Owl, one of those pop-up internet cafes that appear and disappear within months, the kind that exists in that grey area between legitimate business and something else entirely. I should have noticed the warning signs immediately, the blacked-out windows, the lack of other customers despite the weather, the way the attendant barely looked at me as he took my cash. £5 for unlimited time, no ID required, no questions asked. I was a university student back then, working on my dissertation about online communities and digital anthropology. I'd been spending months researching the surface web, but my supervisor had hinted that my work lacked depth, that I needed to explore the darker corners of the internet to truly understand the full spectrum of online behavior. Looking back now, I wonder if he knew what he was sending me into, or if he was just another academic who thought the dark web was merely an interesting theoretical concept rather than the nightmare I was about to experience. The cafe had about 12 stations, each isolated from the others by tall, opaque dividers. Privacy booths, the attendant had called them when I asked. I settled into booth 7, noticing the high-end computer setup. Much better than what you'd typically find in a place charging only £5. The chair was surprisingly comfortable, the keyboard mechanical and responsive. It felt like a setup designed for extended use, not casual browsing. I'd done my homework before venturing into the dark web, downloaded Tor, learned about OPSEC, read countless Reddit threads from people claiming to have explored the hidden services. I thought I was prepared. I thought I was being cautious. I remember thinking how silly all those horror stories seemed now that I was actually doing it. Just another internet connection, just another browser, just different websites. Nothing to be afraid of if you were smart about it. The first hour or so was exactly what I expected. Linked directories, forums discussing privacy, some marketplaces selling things that would make your average high street shopper raise an eyebrow, but nothing that shocked me. I took notes diligently, occasionally glancing around the empty cafe, relieved to have the place to myself. The rain continued to batter the windows, creating a white noise that almost made the environment cozy despite the harsh fluorescent lighting. Then, just as I was considering packing up, satisfied with my initial exploration, a message popped up in the corner of the screen. Not an email or a chat window that I'd opened, just text appearing directly on my desktop. The message mentioned something about booth 7, always bringing in curious ones. I felt that initial spike of adrenaline, that primal response telling me something wasn't right, but I rationalized it immediately. The cafe must monitor their systems. The attendant had probably noticed me accessing Tor and was having a laugh. Perhaps this was even some kind of automated message triggered by certain browsing patterns. I ignored it and continued browsing, clicking through to a forum discussing digital anonymity. Another message appeared, saying they'd been watching me and asking if I wanted to see something real, mentioning Booth 7 was ready for a player. I should have left then. I should have gathered my things, walked out into the rain, and never looked back. Instead, I found myself typing a response, curiosity overwhelming caution. I simply asked who it was. The response was immediate. Some group called Run the Gauntlet, saying I was on their network and my session had been selected. Before I could respond, my browser closed itself and reopened, displaying a black page with a simple interface. A video player in the center, a chat sidebar on the right, and what looked like a scoreboard on the left showing numbers. The video feed showed an empty room with bare concrete walls, a table, and a single chair. The lighting was harsh, industrial. It looked like a basement, or perhaps an abandoned industrial space. At this point, I tried to close the browser, but nothing happened. I tried Control-Alt-Delete, but the system didn't respond. I reached for the power button on the tower, but it was locked behind some kind of case. I considered simply walking out, but something held me there. Academic curiosity, morbid fascination, or perhaps just the paralysis of fear beginning to take hold. The chat sidebar was active with messages scrolling by too quickly to read properly, but I caught fragments about a new player in Booth 7, an unwitting participant, something about a London node being active, and starting bids at £5,000. Whilst I was still processing what I was seeing, a man entered the frame of the video. He wore a balaclava and spoke directly to the camera in accented English. I couldn't place the accent precisely. Eastern European, perhaps. He explained the situation without emotion, like he was reading a weather report. I was now part of a real-time game, selected because of my browsing patterns and location. Booth 7, he explained, was their London gateway, and tonight I wasn't just an observer, but a participant. The rules were simple and terrifying. A variation of Russian roulette. 6 players, 6 rounds. Each round, players would be randomly selected to face the gun. Those who survived would continue to the next round. Those who didn't, well, the implication was clear, without needing elaboration. The winners would walk away with their lives and a share of the money being bet on them by viewers. I was player 6, he informed me. The other 5 were in similar booths across different locations: Prague, Berlin, Moscow, Kiev, and Manchester. All of us had stumbled into this network unwittingly. All of us were now locked into our stations. He explained calmly that we couldn't leave until the game was complete. The booths were secured, emergency exits monitored. He even knew the police response time to my location, 11 minutes. The game would take 9. To demonstrate the reality of the situation, he pointed the camera toward a wall where 5 screens showed feeds from other booths. I could see the other participants, a young woman with purple hair frantically trying to get someone's attention outside her booth, a middle-aged man sitting perfectly still as if in shock, a teenager who appeared to be crying, and 2 others who seemed to be trying to break out of their stations. I felt my heart rate accelerating, my palms sweating as I realized the full gravity of what was happening. This wasn't some elaborate prank or digital simulation. The terror on those people's faces was unmistakably real. The first round began. The roulette selected player 3, the teenager, and player 5, a man who looked to be in his 30s. On screen, 2 men in balaclavas approached them, each holding what appeared to be real handguns. They placed the guns against the participants' temples. The chat exploded with activity, spectators placing bets, commenting on the participants' reactions, discussing the odds as if this were just another sporting event. I was watching in numb horror, unable to look away, unable to fully process that this was happening in real time. The countdown began. 3, 2, 1. A hollow click from Player 3's gun. Relief washed over his young face, tears streaming down his cheeks. Player 5 wasn't so fortunate. The sound was deafening even through my speakers, a sharp crack that seemed to reverberate through my entire body. I won't describe what happened next. I can't. Even now, years later, that image is burned into my memory in a way that no amount of therapy has been able to erase. The man in the balaclava returned to the center of the room, casually informing the survivors that round 2 would begin shortly. 1 down, 4 to go. My odds were improving, he noted, with chilling detachment. I was in full panic mode now, looking around desperately for any way out. The dividers between booths reached almost to the ceiling. The door to my booth had no internal handle. I tried shouting for help, but the booth seemed to be soundproofed. My voice felt muffled, contained, as if the air itself was conspiring to silence me. Round 2 began. The selector chose players 1 and 6. My number. My heart felt like it might explode from my chest. On screen, a man approached my booth, visible now on one of the wall monitors. I hadn't even noticed the camera above my station. He was coming for me, and there was nowhere to run. I heard the cafe door open and close, footsteps approaching. I was frantically looking for anything I could use as a weapon, but the booth was minimalist, just the computer, chair, and a small shelf. The footsteps stopped outside my booth. I could see a shadow beneath the door. I pressed myself against the far corner, as if those few extra inches might somehow save me. The door opened, and a man entered, tall, wearing a black coat, his face concealed by a balaclava, just like in the video. In his hand was what looked like a real pistol. He addressed me quietly as Player 6, London Node, telling me it was my turn. He approached slowly, methodically, the gun hanging loosely at his side. I was begging, pleading, offering money, anything. He didn't respond, his eyes visible through the holes in the balaclava, coldly assessing me. Eventually he spoke, his voice almost gentle. "Just a game," he said. "Someone always loses." I closed my eyes as he pressed the cold metal against my temple. In that moment, everything slowed down. I could hear the rain outside, the soft hum of the computer fan, my own ragged breathing. I thought about my parents, how they would never know what happened to me, how I'd become just another missing person statistic. The man counted down. 3, 2, 1. Click. Empty chamber. The relief that flooded through me was almost painful, a physical sensation that made my legs buckle. I slid down the wall to the floor, gasping for air. The man lowered the gun and turned to leave without a word. On screen, Player 1 wasn't as fortunate. Another crack, another life ended for the entertainment of unseen spectators. I won't recount the remaining rounds in detail. Each was a repeat of the same horrific pattern. By some miracle, or perhaps cruel twist of fate, my number didn't come up again. One by one, the other players faced their turns and lost, until only the purple-haired woman and I remained. Final round, the ultimate game. 1 bullet, 2 players. The chat was frenzied now, massive sums being wagered on which of us would walk away. The selector chose Player 6 again. Me. This time, when the door opened, I didn't beg. A strange calm had settled over me, the kind that comes when terror exceeds your capacity to process it. The man raised the gun again. I stared directly into his eyes, refusing to look away, refusing to close my eyes. If this was my end, I would face it. 3, 2, 1. Click. Nothing. Which meant... On screen, I watched as the purple-haired woman's expression shifted from hope to understanding to terror in the space of a heartbeat. The final shot rang out. Game over. The man in my booth lowered his gun. His words were few but clear. I had survived. My session was ending. He left, closing the door behind him. On screen, the host announced me as the winner. The chat exploded with messages, some congratulating, others expressing disappointment, all discussing the event as if it were just entertainment, not the systematic murder of 5 innocent people. The system unlocked. The browser closed itself. The computer returned to its desktop as if nothing had happened. After what felt like hours, but was probably just minutes, I managed to stand on shaking legs and push open the door of the booth. The cafe was empty. The attendant was gone. Even the sign outside had been removed, leaving just a blank storefront. I stumbled out into the rain, which was still falling heavily, now mixing with my tears as I blindly made my way through the streets. I went to the police, of course. They investigated, but found nothing. The building had been rented under a false identity. The computer in booth 7 had been wiped clean, with no evidence of what I'd witnessed. The other locations couldn't be traced. Without evidence, my story sounded like the delusion of a mentally disturbed student who spent too much time researching internet horror stories. I tried to find information about the other victims, searching news reports for missing persons matching their descriptions. There were too many possibilities, too many people who disappear without a trace every day. I'll never know who they were. It's been years now. I've tried to move on, to convince myself it was some elaborate hoax or hallucination. But deep down, I know what I saw. Sometimes, when I'm online late at night, I catch myself checking my desktop for unexpected messages. And whenever I pass an internet cafe with privacy booths, I walk quickly to the other side of the street, my heart racing at the memory of booth 7 and the game I never agreed to play. The worst part isn't the nightmares or the constant paranoia. It's the knowledge that somewhere out there Run the Gauntlet is still operating, still selecting unwitting participants, still entertaining those who pay to watch. And every time it rains heavily, I wonder who's sitting in booth 7 tonight. The advertisement appeared in my social media feed during one of those endless midnight scrolling sessions when sleep seemed determined to evade me. Woodland retreat, reclaim your peace, it promised, with images of sunlight filtering through ancient trees and minimalist cabins nestled in verdant clearings. I remember pausing, my thumb hovering over the screen. Something about the serenity in those photos calling to the hollow exhaustion that had become my constant companion since losing my job 6 months prior. The winter had been particularly brutal that year. Not just the biting Yorkshire cold or the perpetual grey hanging over the landscape, but the isolation that had slowly wrapped around me. My therapist had suggested a change of environment might help disrupt my patterns of rumination. A reset, she'd called it. So when I saw the retreat offered a special rate for a 2-week digital detox and trauma recovery program, it felt like the universe was offering a lifeline. The journey there was disorienting by design, I realized later. First, the train to a remote station in the Pennines, then a minibus with tinted windows that made it impossible to track our route. There were 4 other participants besides myself, all broken in our own ways, all seeking something that had been taken from us. The retreat itself appeared, at first glance, exactly as advertised. a collection of tasteful wooden structures surrounded by ancient trees, the sound of a stream bubbling nearby. Dr. Manning greeted us with the perfect blend of professional distance and compassionate understanding, explaining our schedule of group and one-on-one therapy sessions throughout our stay. The first few days followed a soothing rhythm: morning meditation, group therapy, individual sessions, nature walks, art therapy. I felt the tight coil of anxiety within me begin to unwind, just slightly. The absence of screens, of news, of social media, it was like having a weight lifted from my chest. But on the fourth night, I woke suddenly with the disorienting sensation that something was wrong. The cabin was pitch black, but I could have sworn I heard the soft click of a door closing. The next morning, I noticed small things out of place. My journal moved slightly on the desk. The sweater I draped over the chair folded differently. The fifth day brought our first deep healing session, which Dr. Manning explained would involve a mild sedative to help us access buried trauma. We were each given a small blue pill with water. I remember hesitating briefly, the pill resting in my palm, a flutter of concern passing through me, but I followed suit with the others. After all, I had come here to heal. The memories of what followed are fragmented. Lying on my bed, watching patterns of light shift across the ceiling as the sedative took hold. Flashes of intense emotion as scenes from my past played out. But there were other moments too. Strange intrusions that didn't belong to my history. A sense of being watched. Hands adjusting my position. A light so bright it penetrated my closed eyelids. Voices discussing my reactions as if I were a specimen. It was during personal reflection time the next day that I first noticed the cameras. Tiny pinprick lenses embedded in the wooden beams, in the spine of a book, in the frame of the bathroom mirror. Once I saw the first, the others revealed themselves like stars emerging at twilight. Security cameras wouldn't be hidden. They wouldn't be in the bathroom, angled toward the shower. They wouldn't be positioned to capture every angle of the bed. I systematically examined my cabin that night, identifying 7 different cameras and a small panel behind the headboard containing technical equipment. Wires, a control box with blinking lights, a transmitter of some kind. The next day passed in forced normalcy and underlying terror. I watched Dr. Manning speak quietly into what appeared to be a wristwatch when he thought no one was looking. I noticed how certain participants were singled out for specialized interventions and returned with an unsettling vacancy behind their eyes. During my scheduled session with Dr. Manning, I made my gravest mistake. He asked how I'd found the deep healing experience, and I mentioned feeling observed and moved. His expression didn't change, but something in his eyes sharpened. A predator recognizing the first stumble of intended prey. I returned to my cabin and began searching for escape. The windows were restricted, the door locked from outside at night. I found a forgotten toolbox beneath the bathroom sink, used the tools to disable every camera I could find, and removed the window restrictor to create an opening just wide enough to squeeze through. After nightfall, I slipped through the window and fled into the dark woods, guided only by weak moonlight and the landmarks I'd memorized during our walks. I'd been moving for perhaps 20 minutes when I heard them. Voices, torchlight, the sounds of a search party. I abandoned the path, plunging deeper into the undergrowth, desperate to find the main road. Hours later, exhausted and disoriented, I glimpsed what appeared to be a straight line through the trees. The road, I thought, but as I broke through the tree line, I discovered it was a service track leading to a modern industrial building in the midst of the woodland. Through its windows, I saw a horror that returns in my nightmares still. A production studio with multiple screens displaying live feeds from the retreat cabins. Other screens showed sterile medical rooms where participants lay unconscious or restrained, subjected to scenarios designed for maximum psychological distress. Most disturbing was the wall of monitors showing a dark web streaming interface where viewers paid to watch these sessions in real time, voting on interventions, requesting specific psychological triggers be exploited. These weren't therapy sessions. They were elaborate psychological torture scenarios broadcast to paying audiences who delighted in watching human suffering. And I had voluntarily walked into this nightmare, handed over my phone, accepted sedatives, shared my deepest traumas, which were now being weaponized against me for entertainment. I managed to steal an unlocked maintenance van and escape to the nearest town, where I stumbled into a police station with my unbelievable story. By the time authorities investigated, the facility had been mostly cleared out, though enough evidence remained to open an investigation. It's been 16 months since my escape. I live under a new name in a new city, checking dark web forums only from public computers. New retreats appear constantly. Wilderness Rebirth, Sanctuary Healing Collective, with the same serene images and promises, and beneath them, announcements for upcoming immersive experiences featuring individuals whose descriptions match new retreat participants. I check every room I enter for cameras. I decline all pills or drinks I haven't prepared myself. I keep the curtains drawn because I know they're still out there creating new content, and I suspect they remember me, the one who got away, whose finale session was promoted but never delivered. The most insidious horror isn't just the violation or exploitation, it's the permanent destruction of my ability to trust. Because once you've seen that healing can be weaponized and vulnerability monetized, the entire world becomes a potential stage set, and every person a possible performer in your private Truman Show of terror. I'd been searching for part-time work to supplement my income from freelance graphic design, something to keep the creditors at bay while I built up my portfolio. The job listing was buried on page 4 of a local creative industries forum. Photography assistant needed for established studio. No experience necessary. Excellent pay. Flexible hours. It seemed perfect, almost suspiciously so. But desperation has a way of silencing those little warning bells that might otherwise save your life. I still remember the chill that ran through me as I first approached Blackstone Studios, an old Victorian textile factory converted into creative spaces, with its red brick facade darkened by decades of industrial pollution and windows that reflected too much and revealed too little. The entrance was around the back, down an alley strewn with cigarette ends and discarded takeaway containers. A heavy steel door with peeling black paint and a small intercom that emitted a static hiss when pressed. Inside the space was cavernous, with high ceilings and exposed beams, the wooden floorboards creaking beneath my feet as I was led through to the main studio. Industrial lights hung from metal frames, casting harsh shadows across seamless white backdrops, and an array of equipment that looked far more sophisticated than what you'd expect in a relatively unknown local studio. Everything was meticulously organized. Lenses arranged by focal length, reflectors stacked according to size, filters in labeled drawers. The apparent professionalism eased my initial discomfort somewhat. The owner, Alex, was soft-spoken with a faint Eastern European accent I couldn't quite place. He moved with deliberate precision, hands always steady, eyes constantly assessing. Looking back, I realize he was studying me in the same clinical way he adjusted his equipment, measuring angles, calculating exposure, determining worth. He explained that the studio specialized in exclusive portraiture for select clients, and that my role would primarily involve administrative tasks, basic equipment maintenance, and occasionally assisting during shoots. The pay was twice what I'd expected, cash in hand, no questions asked. I should have asked questions. I should have walked away. My first week passed uneventfully. I organized bookings, cleaned lenses, learned the filing system for their digital archives. The shoots I assisted with seemed legitimate. Local musicians for album covers, products for e-commerce sites, a few corporate headshots. But I never saw the same client twice, and the studio operated on an unusual schedule, often opening late in the evening and continuing well into the early hours. Alex explained this was to accommodate international clients in different time zones, which seemed reasonable enough at the time. The change began subtly during my second week. New equipment arrived, specialized lighting rigs, medical-grade restraints disguised as posing aids, soundproofing panels installed along the inner walls. A separate room at the back of the studio was designated off-limits, the heavy door secured with an electronic keypad. When I inquired about it, Alex explained it housed expensive vintage equipment and delicate processing chemicals. I nodded, as if this made perfect sense, ignoring the fact that I'd never seen any evidence of film photography or darkroom work in the entirely digital operation. Then came the night that continues to haunt my dreams, to intrude on quiet moments when I let my guard down. Alex had asked me to stay late to help with an important client, someone who had requested absolute discretion and a specific aesthetic that would require additional hands on set. The subject arrived around midnight, a young woman who appeared slightly disoriented, her movements sluggish, as Alex guided her to a chair in the makeup area. Her pupils were dilated, her responses delayed. I remember thinking she might be intoxicated or perhaps just exhausted, rationalizing away the warning signs that now seemed so glaringly obvious. As I helped set up the lighting, I noticed Alex preparing an unusual shot list on his tablet. Close-ups of the woman's hands, her neck, her eyes, detailed documentation of specific parts rather than cohesive portraits. He positioned her against a clinical white backdrop, adjusting her limbs with emotionless precision, occasionally glancing at his phone as if receiving instructions. The woman complied without resistance, her expression vacant, disconnected from what was happening to her body. During a moment when Alex stepped away to adjust the light, I caught a glimpse of his computer screen. It wasn't connected to the standard editing software the studio used, but instead displayed what appeared to be a private broadcasting platform with a chat sidebar filled with messages. I couldn't read them from where I stood, but I saw cryptocurrency amounts being listed alongside timestamps. A cold realization began to form in the pit of my stomach. My suspicions deepened when Alex asked me to help move the woman to the restricted room. The keypad code 2740 is seared into my memory, the soft electronic beep as the lock disengaged, marking the moment my understanding of human depravity expanded beyond what I'd thought possible. Inside, the room was divided into two sections. The first contained broadcasting equipment, multiple screens displaying different camera angles, a sophisticated audio setup. The second, separated by a glass partition, resembled a medical examination room, sterile, bright, with a central table equipped with restraints and surrounded by precision lighting designed to eliminate shadows. Alex instructed me to wait in the first section, while he positioned the woman in the second. As he secured her to the table, I noticed one of the screens displaying a website interface. Dark background, red accents, a title in Cyrillic letters I couldn't understand, and below it, in English, Live in 1500. A countdown timer ticked away beside it. Next to this was what appeared to be a bidding system, with users submitting amounts next to specific requests. I stood frozen, my mind racing to process what I was seeing, to deny the obvious conclusion. This wasn't a photography studio. It was a broadcasting station for dark web torture performances, with the photo shoots serving as documentation of the victims before their ordeal, creating promotional material for upcoming shows. The realization hit me with physical force, my legs nearly buckling beneath me. Alex returned to the control area and began checking the equipment, seemingly oblivious to my horror, or perhaps simply accustomed to it. He handed me a list of timestamps and instructed me to mark them during the broadcast for later editing. His casual tone, the businesslike manner in which he described what would happen next, it was the mundanity of his evil that struck me most deeply. The way he spoke about unspeakable acts as if discussing lighting setups or aperture settings. I mumbled something about needing the toilet and backed out of the room, my hand slipping into my pocket to grasp my phone. In the corridor, I frantically typed a message to the police, trying to describe the location and situation without fully understanding it myself. But as I moved toward the exit, Alex appeared in the doorway of the restricted room, his expression shifting as he registered the phone in my hand, the fear in my eyes, the betrayal of my knowledge. What followed was a nightmarish chase through the labyrinthine building. I fled down staircases and through abandoned floors of the old factory, hearing Alex's measured footsteps behind me, never hurried yet somehow always gaining. I remember the scratch of rough brick against my palms as I pressed myself into dark corners, the taste of blood from biting my lip to stay silent, the distant sound of traffic on the main road, so close yet impossibly far. I eventually found an emergency exit at the back of the ground floor, the push bar releasing with a crash that seemed to echo through the entire building. I ran blindly into the night, not stopping until I reached the main road where a night bus was pulling up. I boarded without checking its destination, collapsed into a seat, and watched the darkened buildings recede as we pulled away from the northern quarter. The police response was frustratingly inadequate. Without concrete evidence beyond my testimony, and with my panicked description lacking specifics about the website or the victim's identity, their investigation moved slowly. By the time they obtained a warrant 3 days later, Blackstone Studios had been cleared out, equipment gone, hard drives removed, walls repainted. The woman I had seen that night was never identified. In the months that followed, I obsessively researched dark web broadcasting, trying to find some trace of the operation, some way to identify the perpetrators or help their victims. Using borrowed laptops in public libraries and anonymous browsing tools, I discovered an underground network of similar studios across Europe and beyond, each operating under the guise of legitimate creative businesses. Photography studios, indie film productions, modeling agencies, all perfect covers for acquiring victims and equipment without raising suspicion. The most disturbing discovery came 6 months later, when I found a forum discussing a notorious broadcaster who had recently changed location. Attached was a production still, the clinical white backdrop I recognized from Blackstone, the same lighting setup, the same clinical framing. but the most chilling detail was barely visible in the corner of the image. A reflection in a metal surface, distorted but recognizable. My own face, captured during what I had thought was a legitimate photo shoot during my first week. I had been documented just like the victims, perhaps as insurance, perhaps as a potential subject. The thought that my image might still be circulating in those dark corners of the internet, that Alex might still be searching for the assistant who fled, keeps me looking over my shoulder even now. I've moved cities twice since then, changed my appearance, abandoned social media. I work exclusively from home, designing under a pseudonym, payments routed through multiple accounts. Some might call it paranoia. I call it survival. Sometimes I wonder what happened to that woman on the table, if she survived that night, if she even remembers what happened to her in that sterile room. I wonder how many others have taken her place since then. How many studios like Blackstone continue to operate behind unremarkable facades in cities around the world. Most of all, I wonder if anyone who views those broadcasts ever recognizes the true horror, not in the explicit violence being performed, but in the deliberate, methodical documentation that preceded it, the camera that first captured a human being and transformed them into content. Because that's what I understood in that moment behind the studio door. The camera doesn't just record dehumanization, it begins it. The lens that frames, that crops, that isolates parts from the whole, is the first act of violence. And somewhere out there, someone is still adjusting the perfect exposure for the next victim, still waiting for the red light that signals they're live. I used to obsessively check my reflection in shop windows, constantly rehearsing expressions in my mind, imagining my face on billboards and magazine covers. That desperate hunger for validation, for someone to finally see the potential I believe burned inside me. It's embarrassing to admit how all-consuming it was, but that's what makes places like Elite Casting so dangerous. They know exactly what you're willing to risk when you've convinced yourself that fame is just one lucky breakaway. I found the casting call on an industry forum I'd been following for months, one of those semi-professional websites where legitimate opportunities occasionally surface among the scams. The post stood out because it wasn't promising the usual vague exposure or unpaid work. Instead, it offered a substantial daily rate for a luxury fashion campaign, specifically seeking distinctive faces, not conventional beauty. My heart raced as I read those words. I'd been told countless times by well-meaning friends that my look was too unique for commercial modeling, a polite way of saying I wasn't conventionally attractive enough. But here was someone explicitly wanting what I had. The application process seemed thorough, which only reinforced my belief in its legitimacy. I submitted my measurements, recent photographs, and a brief bio highlighting my limited experience. A student fashion show at university, a friend's photography project, nothing that would impress a real agency. 3 days later, an email arrived confirming I'd been shortlisted and inviting me to an in-person casting at their Leeds office. The message included professional-looking documentation, an NDA emphasizing the confidential nature of the upcoming campaign, details about the renowned but unnamed designer, and what to wear to the casting. I spent hours selecting the perfect minimalist outfit, practicing walking with the straight-backed confidence I'd observed in models on runway videos. The address led me to a converted textile mill in the industrial quarter of the city, one of those red brick Victorian buildings that developers had transformed into sleek, modern office spaces while preserving the original facade. Elite Casting occupied the entire top floor, accessible via a service lift that required a code texted to me that morning. Everything about the space radiated exclusivity and professionalism. Polished concrete floors, exposed brick walls adorned with black and white campaign photographs. Minimalist furniture that looked expensive in its deliberate simplicity. Large windows flooded the reception area with natural light, highlighting the dust particles drifting lazily through the air, creating an almost ethereal atmosphere that felt separate from the gritty streets below. A receptionist with immaculate makeup took my details, asked me to sign another NDA, and directed me to a waiting area where 3 other potential models sat scrolling through their phones. They all had that same distinctive quality mentioned in the casting call. Interesting faces rather than conventional beauty. I felt simultaneously reassured and competitive, studying their features while pretending to check my own phone. None of us spoke, each wrapped in our private anticipation. The silence broken only by the occasional sound of a door opening down the corridor as candidates emerged from their castings. After 40 minutes that stretched like hours, an assistant called my name. I followed her through a series of corridors to a large studio space where 3 people sat behind a table, laden with laptops and documents. They introduced themselves as the casting director, the campaign photographer, and a representative from the design house. Their professional demeanor, their casual references to major fashion weeks and well-known industry figures. Every detail reinforced the legitimacy of the operation. I stood on a marked spot under perfectly positioned lights while they asked standard questions about my experience and availability, making notes on tablets as I responded. The casting director explained that this campaign was taking an innovative approach, focusing on unfiltered, authentic content that would be released across multiple platforms. The concept sounded vague, yet impressive, full of buzzwords about breaking boundaries and challenging conventional beauty standards. He then asked if I would be comfortable doing a brief screen test to assess how I moved on camera. This, he explained, was more important than traditional modeling experience, as the campaign would involve video content for social media, as well as still photography. The photographer led me to an adjoining room, smaller, more intimate, with a simple white backdrop and professional lighting equipment. A high-definition camera was mounted on a tripod, pointing at a plain wooden chair in the center of the space. The setup seemed standard enough, though I remember noticing there were no windows in this room, unlike the rest of the office. The photographer explained that she needed to adjust some equipment and would be back momentarily, leaving me alone to get comfortable in the space. As I waited, I noticed a small red light blinking on the camera. It was already recording. Strange, but perhaps this was part of the process, capturing natural moments rather than posed ones. I also became aware of how quiet the room was, a complete absence of the ambient noise that had filled the rest of the office. The walls appeared thicker here, possibly soundproofed for recording purposes. These details registered as professional considerations rather than warning signs, evidence of a high-end operation rather than something sinister. The photographer returned with what she described as a simple outfit for the screen test. A plain black tank top and shorts that seemed more suitable for a fitness shoot than high fashion. When I hesitantly mentioned this discrepancy, she explained that they needed to see how different body types moved naturally before designing the final campaign looks. It sounded reasonable enough at the time, though now the memory makes me nauseous. I changed behind a small partition, increasingly aware of the camera's unblinking eye, wondering if it had been turned off during this process, but too intimidated by the professional environment to ask. The screen test began innocuously. Simple poses, turning to show different angles, basic movement sequences. But gradually, the photographer's instructions shifted. She asked me to show more skin, to adjust the clothing to reveal more of my shoulders, my collarbone. The directions became increasingly specific about how I should move, how I should touch my own skin, how I should express certain emotions. Each request was presented as a standard industry practice, each boundary pushed with the assurance that this was normal, that major models did this every day, that my hesitation only revealed my inexperience. I remember the exact moment when discomfort crystallized into fear. The photographer had stepped out again, supposedly to consult with the casting director about the next sequence. I rose from the chair, intending to stretch my legs, and noticed a small panel on the wall behind the camera had slid open slightly, revealing what appeared to be another room beyond, darker, filled with additional screens showing different angles of the space I occupied. For a brief second, I glimpsed multiple figures watching intently. Then the panel silently closed. My instinct screamed to leave immediately, but doubt crept in. Perhaps this was normal, a separate control room for technical staff. I'd never been to a professional casting before. Maybe this was standard procedure I was misinterpreting due to nervousness. The thought of walking out, of potentially burning bridges in an industry I desperately wanted to enter, made me hesitate just long enough for the photographer to return, this time with a male assistant carrying additional equipment. The atmosphere shifted subtly. The photographer's instructions became colder, more demanding. The assistant positioned what appeared to be restraints on the chair, explaining them as posing aids that would help maintain specific positions for longer sequences. When I expressed concern, they exchanged a look I couldn't interpret. The photographer reminded me of the confidentiality agreement I'd signed, emphasizing the competitive nature of the industry and how many aspiring models would gladly take my place if I wasn't serious about the opportunity. I agreed to continue, allowing them to secure my wrist to the chair's armrests with what they called comfort straps, thinking I could ask to be released if things went further than I was comfortable with. It was only when they fastened the final restraint across my ankles that I realized the terrible miscalculation I'd made. These weren't posing aids. They were proper restraints, tightening rather than loosening when I pulled against them. The photographer's demeanor transformed entirely. She stepped back, assessed me with clinical detachment, then spoke into a small microphone attached to her lapel, confirming that the subject was secured and they were ready to begin the real casting. The assistant wheeled in additional equipment, another camera on a movable arm that could capture close-up angles, a laptop connected to what appeared to be a broadcasting setup. With growing horror, I watched as they adjusted settings on the computer, revealing a web page with a dark background and red text in a language I didn't recognize. Below this was an English interface showing a livestream count, a bidding section, and a chat window where messages were already appearing. This wasn't a modeling casting. It was a dark web broadcast, with me as the unwitting content. The photographer explained in detached terms what would happen next. This was indeed a casting, but not for a fashion campaign. They were talent scouts for an exclusive online network that provided specialized content to paying subscribers around the world. The restraint session was being broadcast live as a preview, with viewers already placing bids for what would follow. Those with the highest bids would dictate what happened to me over the next several hours. My consent was irrelevant. My signature on their falsified documents would be manipulated to suggest I had agreed to everything. I'll spare you the details of what followed. though the memories replay in vivid, unwanted detail whenever I close my eyes. I can still feel the clinical touch of latex gloves against my skin, still hear the mechanical whir of the camera adjusting for close-ups, still see the laptop screen flickering with incoming messages from faceless viewers suggesting increasingly depraved scenarios. Throughout it all, they maintained that professional facade, discussing angles and lighting as if this were indeed just another fashion shoot, the mundane normality of their technical conversation a grotesque counterpoint to what they were documenting. It ended abruptly when an alarm sounded elsewhere in the building. A fire drill, a security breach. I never learned what. The assistant hurriedly released my restraints, while the photographer packed essential equipment. They seemed practiced at rapid evacuation, suggesting this wasn't their first emergency exit. I was warned that any attempt to report what had happened would result in the footage being released publicly, with my personal details attached. They had my address, my full name, my social media accounts, all freely provided in my eager application. In the chaos, I managed to grab my original clothes and fled down a back stairwell, emerging into an alley behind the building where other office workers were gathering at a fire assembly point, entirely unaware of what had occurred floors above them. I walked away as calmly as I could manage on trembling legs, fighting the urge to run until I had turned several corners. The police report I filed the next day went nowhere. The address I led them to housed a legitimate business consultancy firm that had occupied the space for years. Elite Casting had never existed there. The website where I'd found the original posting had no record of it. The emails I'd received were sent from accounts that no longer existed. Even the photographs I'd submitted had vanished from my sent items folder, as if someone had accessed my accounts and meticulously erased every digital trace of the interaction. 2 weeks later, a message appeared in my spam folder. A link, nothing else. Against every rational instinct, I clicked it. It led to a countdown timer on a black background, beneath which was a thumbnail image of me, restrained in that chair, my face partially obscured, but clearly recognizable to anyone who knew me. The countdown showed 3 days remaining. I deleted my social media accounts that same hour, withdrew from university the following day, and moved back to my parents' home in Northumberland by the end of the week, claiming a mental health crisis that wasn't entirely a lie. The countdown expired without consequence that I'm aware of. Perhaps it was just a final psychological torture, or perhaps the content is circulating in corners of the internet I'll never visit. I've changed my name now, dyed my hair, altered my appearance as much as possible without surgery. I work nights at a supermarket distribution center where interactions are minimal and photographs non-existent. Sometimes I think about the others in that waiting room, wonder if they met the same fate or managed to escape. I've searched missing persons reports, scanned news stories for anything that might connect to what happened, but found nothing conclusive. Elite Casting, or whatever they really call themselves, are professionals at covering their tracks. The most haunting part isn't what they did, it's how expertly they exploited my deepest desires. They knew exactly what to offer, exactly what language would bypass my natural caution. They understood that my hunger to be seen, to be validated, would blind me to the warning signs that now seem so glaringly obvious. They recognized something desperate in me that I hadn't fully acknowledged to myself. That's the real horror of the dark web, not just what happens there, but how it intersects with the ordinary world, how easily normal ambitions can lead you down twisted corridors. The monsters don't always lurk in shadows. Sometimes they sit behind casting tables in well-lit offices. wearing designer clothes and speaking the language of opportunity. And sometimes, the thing that makes you vulnerable isn't weakness, but wanting. The perfectly human desire to be chosen, to be special, to be seen. I can't bear to be photographed now. I flinch when friends raise phones for group pictures, make excuses to step away. I've stuck tape over every camera lens on every device I own, because I know that somewhere out there, people are still watching me through that first recording. Strangers who paid to see me broken down frame by frame. And somewhere, another casting call is being written, another trap set, another desperate hopeful preparing for their big break without realizing it's really just a breaking. The listing appeared exactly when I needed it most. Ultra-secure private accommodation for those requiring absolute discretion, it promised, with photos of a modern flat, with reinforced doors, blackout blinds, and a state-of-the-art security system. Having just fled my flat in Bristol after my ex discovered my new address, I was desperate for somewhere he couldn't possibly find me. The price was steep but manageable. A small sacrifice for peace of mind after months of looking over my shoulder. The booking process was unusually thorough. Beyond the standard identity verification, they required detailed information about my situation, my daily habits, even my medical history. I justified each invasive question as necessary for their security protocols. The confirmation arrived with elaborate check-in instructions and a strict warning not to share my location with anyone. I remember feeling almost grateful for their thoroughness. Finally, someone taking stalking seriously. The location surprised me. A converted warehouse in a semi-industrial area outside Birmingham. Not the residential neighborhood I'd expected. The exterior was deliberately nondescript, concrete and steel with minimal windows and no identifying signage. My access code opened a reinforced door leading to a Spartan lobby with a second security door. The property manager wasn't present as promised, but a tablet mounted on the wall guided me through a facial recognition scan and directed me to flat 7. Inside, the space matched the photos perfectly. Minimalist furniture, stainless steel kitchen, windows with electronic blinds that could be completely sealed. The promised security features were everywhere. Motion sensors in each corner, fingerprint locks on interior doors, a panic button beside the bed. I remember running my hand appreciatively along the solid front door with its 3 deadbolts and reinforced frame. For the first time in months, I felt I could breathe. The first oddity I noticed was the absence of outward-facing cameras. For a property so focused on security, all monitoring seemed directed inward. The tablet that controlled the flat systems showed multiple camera feeds, bathroom, bedroom, living area, but none covering the corridor or entrance. I initially rationalized this as privacy protection for other residents, though I hadn't seen or heard evidence of any neighbors. By evening, other discrepancies became apparent. The windows, while appearing to overlook the city, never changed with the fading light. Closer inspection revealed they were actually high-resolution screens displaying pre-recorded views. The air circulation was perfect despite no apparent ventilation. Most disturbing, the panic button beside the bed had no wiring behind it, just a hollow space in the wall. That night, I woke to a subtle change in the ambient sound. The barely perceptible background hum had altered its frequency. In the darkness, I noticed a red light on the ceiling camera that hadn't been active earlier. As I stared at it, text appeared on the tablet beside my bed. Subject awake. Monitoring preferences selected. Auction commencing. Horror flooded through me as I realized the truth. This wasn't a safe house. It was a viewing gallery. Someone was watching, evaluating, preparing to bid on something. On me. The elaborate intake forms, the detailed personal history, the medical questions. They weren't security protocols, but a catalogue description. Frantically, I tried the door. The locks that had earlier made me feel protected now imprisoned me. The reinforced windows wouldn't break despite my desperate attempts with a chair. I screamed for help, but the room's perfect acoustics suddenly made sense. The space was completely soundproofed. The tablet continued updating. Auction complete. Buyer protocol initiating in 3000. A countdown timer appeared, ticking away the hours until whatever came next. I spent those 3 hours searching desperately for escape, tearing the flat apart for any weakness in its seemingly perfect containment. As the timer approached 0, a new message appeared. Preparation sequence initiating. The ventilation sound changed again, and a sweet, chemical smell permeated the air. My limbs grew heavy, my thoughts clouding as I fought to remain conscious. My last memory before darkness claimed me was the main door finally opening, revealing not the exit corridor but a clinical white room beyond, where figures in masks waited with equipment I couldn't identify. I woke days later on the outskirts of Birmingham with surgical dressings on my abdomen, a burner phone containing a single message, payment complete, and no memory of what had been taken from me. The safe house had disappeared from all booking sites, my transaction history altered to show I'd never made the reservation. Sometimes, in certain lights, I see tiny glints beneath my skin that weren't there before. Tracking devices, perhaps, or something worse. I live in constant fear that whoever purchased me that night might someday decide they want more than what they've already taken. That the auction I unwittingly participated in might have been just the beginning. The cruelest irony, I'd fled to that safe house terrified of one specific threat, only to deliver myself into the hands of something far worse, an unseen marketplace where safety is simply another commodity to be exploited, where the most secure prison is one the captive willingly enters, grateful for the locks that will ultimately trap them. The shipping container's corrugated metal walls still appear in my dreams, those industrial ridges casting thin shadows across terrified faces. I remember the exact moment I regained consciousness, the acrid smell of chemicals lingering in my nostrils, the cold steel against my cheek, the distant sound of waves suggesting we were near water. My wrists were bound with plastic ties that bit into my skin each time I moved, leaving marks I still trace absent-mindedly during sleepless nights. The previous evening had been unremarkable. I'd left work late, trudging through London's persistent drizzle toward the tube station, my mind occupied with mundane concerns about rent increases and unanswered emails. The van that pulled alongside me seemed like ordinary delivery transport, nothing to warrant a second glance in the city's busy streets. I don't remember the moment they took me, just a sudden sweet smell as a cloth pressed against my face. Then nothing until I woke in that container. I wasn't alone. 4 others lay scattered across the floor, similarly bound, gradually stirring to consciousness beneath the harsh glare of industrial LED strips that hung from the ceiling. None of us knew each other. A university student returning from a night out, an off-duty nurse still in scrubs, a middle-aged businessman in a rumpled suit, and an elderly woman who seemed remarkably composed despite the circumstances. Strangers united only by our confusion and escalating fear. What made the situation immediately more terrifying was the surveillance equipment positioned throughout the container. 4 high-definition cameras mounted in each corner, their red recording lights glowing steadily. A large monitor on the far wall, currently displaying a black screen with white text reading "Preparing Stream." A laptop sat on a small metal table, its screen showing what appeared to be a website interface. Dark background, red accents, a chat window where messages occasionally scroll past too quickly to read. The unmistakable aesthetics of a dark web broadcast. As we struggled to comprehend our situation, the monitor flickered to life, displaying a split screen of the container from multiple angles, alongside a bidding interface where anonymous users were already placing substantial amounts in cryptocurrency. A timer appeared, counting down from 30 minutes. Below it, text explained the game in clinical terms. When the timer reached 0, each of us would be required to select another person in the container to die. The person receiving the most votes would be executed on camera. If we refused to choose, all of us would be killed. I remember the distinct feeling of unreality that washed over me, the desperate hope that this was some elaborate prank or social experiment. That hope evaporated when our captors demonstrated their seriousness by activating small explosive charges attached to the businessman's restraints, taking his right hand cleanly at the wrist when someone attempted to remove their bindings. The smell of cauterized flesh and his muffled screams solidified the nightmare into undeniable reality. The most disturbing element wasn't the explicit threat of violence, but the interaction happening on screen. Viewers were placing bets on our choices, commenting on our physical appearances, our apparent emotional states, our perceived likelihood of survival. We weren't people to them. We were characters in a brutal form of entertainment, our suffering quantified in cryptocurrency and viewer engagement metrics. As the timer ticked down, I found myself studying the others with a horrifying new perspective, evaluating them not as fellow victims, but as potential sacrifices. The student was young, had a full life ahead of him. The nurse saved lives for a living. The elderly woman had perhaps lived a full life already. The businessman was already injured. Each thought made me more disgusted with myself, yet I couldn't stop the calculations. With 5 minutes remaining, the bidding intensified. Special offers appeared on screen. Pay extra to force specific confrontations, to remove the binding from one participant, to add additional tools to the container. The highest bidder's preferences were implemented immediately by unseen mechanisms. The container floor shifted as compartments opened, revealing implements I cannot bring myself to describe even now. In those final moments, I caught my reflection in the polished metal surface of the table. Wild-eyed, sweat-streaked, unrecognizable to myself. I had entered the container as one person and would leave as another, if I left at all. The timer reached 1 minute, and electronic tablets were delivered through a slot in the wall, one for each of us, displaying the faces of everyone in the container, requiring our selection. What happened next haunts me more than anything else. Not the violence that followed, not the mechanical execution of the group's decision, but the moment I made my choice. The absolute clarity with which I selected another human being to die so that I might live. The relief I felt when the tablet confirmed my selection. The shameful gratitude when enough others made the same choice, ensuring it wouldn't be me. I survived that night. 2 others did as well. The authorities found us 3 days later when dock workers heard sounds from the abandoned container. The website had vanished, the equipment professionally sanitized of evidence. The investigation stalled after several months, labeled as a probable organized crime incident from Eastern Europe. Sometimes I catch strangers looking at me with an odd recognition I can't explain. On particularly dark nights, I wonder if the stream is still accessible somewhere in the digital underworld. If anonymous viewers still watch my decision, my survival, my shame as entertainment during their exploration of hidden websites. But what truly keeps me awake isn't the fear of being recognized or found by those who orchestrated the game. It's the knowledge that somewhere right now, another container is being prepared, another stream is counting down, and ordinary people like me are discovering the terrible truth about what they're capable of when the only other option is their own destruction. And somewhere, someone is watching, placing bets, enjoying the spectacle of human beings forcing each other's hands. Even now, 3 years later, I can't scroll through social media without my stomach lurching at the sight of those aspirational lifestyle photos. Perfect people in perfect settings, sharing their supposedly perfect lives. The sound of a notification ping sends me into a cold sweat. Sometimes I catch myself staring at influencers' vacation posts, wondering if they know what might be happening just beyond the carefully composed frame of their photos. It began with an email that felt like winning the lottery, an exclusive invitation to the Sylvan Circle Creators Retreat, a week-long networking event in a remote part of the Scottish Highlands. Only 20 content creators selected, all expenses paid, with promised connections to major brands and potential sponsorship deals worth tens of thousands of pounds. For someone like me, hovering at just under 50,000 followers and desperately trying to turn my travel content into a sustainable career, it seemed like the breakthrough I'd been chasing since dropping out of university 2 years prior. My parents had been skeptical about my career choice from the beginning, their only child abandoning a sensible marketing degree to photograph herself in scenic locations, chasing likes and brand partnerships. This retreat was my chance to prove them wrong, to show that the long hours of content creation and engagement building could translate into something legitimate. I remember my mother's concerned expression as I packed, her warnings about going somewhere so isolated with strangers. I dismissed her fears with the casual arrogance of someone who believed bad things only happened to other people. The journey to the retreat felt like progressively leaving the real world behind. First a train from Glasgow to Inverness, then a private shuttle through increasingly remote landscapes, and finally a narrow dirt track that wound through ancient pine forests to a modern compound of sleek cabins arranged around a central lodge. The contrast between the primal wilderness and the retreat's minimalist luxury created an unsettling dissonance that I initially mistook for exclusivity. Our hosts, representatives from what they called a private content investment collective, welcomed us with champagne and gift bags containing high-end tech accessories and personalized itineraries. We were an eclectic group: fashion influencers, travel content creators like myself, fitness personalities, a couple of gaming streamers, and even a minor celebrity chef. All of us shared the same hungry look behind our practiced smiles, the same desperate need to climb higher in the ruthless hierarchy of digital relevance. The first 2 days unfolded like a dream. Workshops on monetization strategies, professional photo shoots in stunning natural settings, one-on-one sessions with marketing experts who hinted at life-changing opportunities. We were encouraged to post about the retreat, though asked to keep the exact location private for exclusivity reasons. In the evenings, we gathered in the main lodge for elaborate meals and networking drinks. everyone performing their most charming, authentic selves, while carefully assessing the competition. The strange elements were easy to dismiss at first. The lack of reliable mobile signal didn't seem suspicious for such a remote location, and the satellite Wi-Fi that only worked through their monitored network seemed like a reasonable limitation of the setting. The numerous security cameras were explained as protection against overzealous fans who might have tracked prominent attendees. Even the daily medical checks were framed as a luxury service, ensuring our optimal performance during the intensive program. It was during the third night that I noticed the first real warning sign. Unable to sleep, I stepped outside my cabin for some air and saw staff members escorting one of the fitness influencers, a woman named Kaya with over 2 million followers, toward the administrative building at the edge of the compound. She seemed unsteady, almost sedated, supported between two men who moved with efficient purpose rather than concern. When I mentioned seeing this at breakfast, the retreat director explained that Kaya had suffered an allergic reaction and had been taken to receive medical attention. She would be rejoining us later, he assured everyone. But Kaya never reappeared. Instead, her belongings were removed from her cabin while we were out on a guided hike, and by dinner, it was as if she had never existed. No one questioned this openly, though I caught exchanged glances between some of the others. That night, checking social media through the retreat's network, I noticed something odd. Kaya's accounts were actively posting content, apparently showing her enjoying a spontaneous trip to Barcelona. The posts seemed authentic at first glance, but looking closer, I realized they were all created using previously captured footage, subtly edited to appear current. The following morning brought a new development. A mysterious leaderboard appeared in the main lodge, ranking all participants based on an unspecified scoring system. My name hovered near the bottom of the list, while others like Jamie, a charismatic travel YouTuber, and Eliza, a fashion influencer with a distinctive aesthetic, topped the rankings. The staff encouraged us to improve our standings through engaged participation, without ever clarifying what this meant. That same day, our activities took a darker turn. The workshop shifted from marketing strategies to discussions about loyalty and sacrifice for success. We were asked to complete psychological profiles, ranking our personal ethics and boundaries in hypothetical scenarios. During meals, staff circulated with tablets showing our real-time social media analytics alongside our leaderboard positions, creating an atmosphere of intense competition and paranoia. On the fifth night, after another participant, a gaming streamer who had vocally questioned the retreat's increasingly strange activities, disappeared under similar circumstances to Kaya, I decided to investigate. Waiting until after midnight, I slipped out of my cabin and made my way to the administrative building I'd seen earlier. A window left slightly ajar allowed me to hear voices from within, clinical discussions about extraction value and audience engagement metrics that made little sense until I managed to peer inside. What I saw continues to haunt my darkest moments. A sophisticated broadcasting studio where multiple screens displayed live feeds from our cabins, our workshops, even our private bathrooms. But most horrifying was the largest monitor, showing what appeared to be a dark web streaming platform where anonymous viewers were placing bids and commenting on the contestants. With sickening clarity, I realized we weren't retreat participants. We were unwitting performers in some twisted reality elimination game where being voted off had consequences far beyond lost followers. In one corner of the room, a medical area had been established where the missing participants appeared to be held in sedated states, cameras documenting everything. According to the on-screen metrics, the highest viewing numbers and bidding activity occurred during these elimination sequences. I couldn't see exactly what happened after the sedation, but the clinical tools arranged nearby suggested something surgical, something final. I backed away in silent horror, nearly collapsing with the shock of understanding. The entire retreat was a front for a dark web channel that monetized the exploitation and eventual elimination of desperate content creators. People so hungry for fame, they'd walk willingly into isolation, surrendering their privacy and ultimately their safety for the promise of recognition. The next morning brought the announcement of another departure. Jamie, who had been top of the leaderboard just hours earlier. As a staff member explained his sudden allergic reaction with the same practice concern they'd used before, I noticed something chilling. Tiny adjustments in everyone's scores following the announcement. Highest gains for those who seemed most visibly affected by the news. We were being rewarded for our emotional reactions, our authentic distress generating engagement from unseen viewers. That night, I rose to third on the leaderboard after genuinely breaking down during a vulnerability workshop where we discussed our deepest fears. The retreat director personally congratulated me on my breakthrough performance, the gleam in his eyes revealing the double meaning in his words. I smiled through my terror, suddenly understanding the game well enough to play it, to perform distress without raising suspicion, to appear invested while planning escape. For 2 more days, I maintained this delicate deception, gathering information and searching for weaknesses in their security. I discovered that the elimination selections weren't entirely based on the leaderboard. They targeted those who asked too many questions, who seemed suspicious, or paradoxically, those generating the highest viewer engagement. The perfect victims were the ones whose disappearances would create the most compelling content without risking exposure. My opportunity came during a staged power outage designed to film our reactions to isolation and darkness. In the confusion, I slipped away from the group, using the maintenance access I'd identified earlier to reach the perimeter fence. The journey through miles of highland wilderness that followed, barefoot after losing my shoes in a stream crossing, using stars for navigation, feels like something that happened to someone else, a survival story from a person I no longer recognize. I eventually reached a remote farmhouse where a suspicious but ultimately kind elderly couple allowed me to contact police. By the time authorities reached the retreat location 3 days later, the entire operation had vanished. Buildings emptied, equipment removed, not so much as a footprint remaining. The investigation stalled with jurisdictional complications and lack of evidence beyond my testimony, which sounded increasingly delusional even to my own ears as days passed. The most horrifying epilogue came 6 weeks later, when I discovered that all the missing influencers' accounts remained active, posting computer-generated content that mimicked their styles with uncanny accuracy. Their digital ghosts continued accumulating followers, hawking products, maintaining the illusion of aspirational lives that had already ended. No one in their audiences seemed to notice the subtle differences, the absence of true humanity behind the carefully filtered images. I deleted all my social media that day. Sometimes I check on those accounts, watching artificial intelligence perpetuate the personas of people who wanted fame badly enough to die for it, wondering if their audiences will ever realize they're following phantoms. More disturbing still is the knowledge that somewhere, the Sylvan Circle has simply relocated, rebranded, and recruited a new cast of ambitious creators desperate enough to ignore every warning sign. Each time I see another viral challenge, another dangerous trend pursued for views, Another isolated retreat promoted by smiling influencers. I want to scream warnings into the void. But who would listen? In a world where attention is currency and authenticity is performance, what could be more authentic than real fear, real elimination, real consequences? The ultimate content for a viewership numbed by endless performative reality. Silicon dreams have a way of blinding you to what's right in front of your eyes. The gleaming potential of innovation, the intoxicating rush of being part of something revolutionary. It creates a peculiar kind of tunnel vision that I now recognize as dangerous. My mother always said I was too trusting, too eager to see the best in people and situations. She wasn't wrong. That optimism nearly cost me everything when I joined Neurosync, the AI startup that promised to change how humans process information forever. I'd spent 4 years at Cambridge earning my computer science degree, followed by a soul-crushing 18 months coding banking software that paid well, but left me creatively starved. When the Neurosync recruiter approached me at a tech meetup in London, describing their vision of neural interface algorithms that could enhance human learning capacity, it felt like the universe was finally offering me a chance to do something meaningful. Their offices in Shoreditch occupied the top 3 floors of a converted warehouse, all exposed brick, polished concrete, and dramatic floor-to-ceiling windows that flooded the open workspace with natural light. The kind of environment that makes you feel important just by existing within it. The interview process was grueling. 6 rounds of technical assessments, personality profiling, and strange hypothetical scenarios testing ethical boundaries. Looking back, I should have recognized those ethics questions as red flags, particularly the ones about privacy, surveillance, and the greater good. But I was dazzled by the founder, Dr. Chen, a former neuroscientist turned tech visionary whose TED Talks had millions of views. His intense focus when he interviewed me personally made me feel seen in a way I hadn't experienced before, as if he recognized something in me that even I didn't fully understand. I started as a back-end developer on their core algorithm team, working punishing hours fueled by free gourmet meals and the cultish camaraderie that develops when a small group believes they're changing the world together. The company culture had all the startup cliches: meditation rooms, Friday drinking sessions, inspirational quotes painted on walls. But beneath that familiar veneer was something else, something I initially couldn't name, but felt as a subtle wrongness that I dismissed as imposter syndrome. The first concrete oddity I noticed was the server room on the restricted 3rd floor. Most startups use cloud services rather than maintaining extensive on-site infrastructure. But Neurosync had a substantial server farm that consumed enormous power and required dedicated cooling systems. When I asked about it, my team lead explained they needed physical servers for data security and proprietary hardware integration. It sounded plausible enough, though the biometric access protocol seemed excessive even for a security-conscious company. 3 months into my employment, I began noticing patterns in the network traffic that didn't align with our development activities. Massive data transfers occurred during odd hours, particularly between 2 and 4 a.m., creating noticeable system lag that affected our daytime work. When I mentioned this to my supervisor, his reaction was disproportionately severe, a flash of panic quickly masked by forced casualness as he explained it away as automated backup procedures. My curiosity might have ended there if not for Eliza, our network security specialist, who pulled me aside after a team meeting with genuine fear in her eyes. She'd noticed the same anomalies but had traced them further, discovering encrypted streams being broadcast through obscure channels to destinations she couldn't identify. She'd raised concerns directly with Chen and was immediately reassigned to a different project with restricted system access. Before she left, transferred suddenly to the Singapore office, she slipped me an access key and a hastily scribbled note about server cabinet B7. For 2 weeks, I did nothing with that key. My position at Neurosync had become the cornerstone of my identity. I'd cut contact with friends who couldn't understand my dedication to work, moved to a flat within walking distance of the office, even begun dating another developer whose life was similarly consumed by the company. The thought of jeopardizing all that felt impossible, even as the strange network patterns continued and 3 more employees were abruptly relocated after asking the wrong questions. It was a system crash at 3:17 a.m. that finally compelled me to act. I'd been working late, alone in the office, when every monitor simultaneously went blank before rebooting. In that brief window of system vulnerability, I caught a glimpse of an unfamiliar interface momentarily displayed on my screen. A dark background with a red timer and what appeared to be a bidding panel. It vanished so quickly I might have imagined it, except for the split-second image that remained burned in my mind. A live video feed of what looked disturbingly like a person strapped to a chair in the sterile white room. That night, I used Eliza's key to access the server room, while the cleaning crew provided cover for my presence in the building. Cabinet B7 was segregated from the others, connected to independent power supplies and cooling systems. The servers themselves were standard hardware, but attached to them was custom equipment I didn't recognize. Components with no manufacturer logos, sophisticated transmission devices, and most alarmingly, a standalone storage system containing what appeared to be thousands of hours of video files with alphanumeric labels instead of conventional file names. I downloaded several files onto an encrypted drive, heart pounding so violently I feared it might trigger the motion sensors. Back at my flat, behind locked doors, and with my network connection disabled, I accessed the first file. What I saw destroyed every illusion I'd maintained about Neurosync's noble mission. The footage showed exactly what I'd glimpsed during the system crash, a person restrained in a clinical setting. But this was no medical procedure or consensual research. The room was designed like a sterile stage set, with perfect lighting capturing every detail as masked figures systematically tortured the struggling subject. Overlaid on the video was the interface I'd glimpsed, a bidding system where unseen viewers could pay in cryptocurrency to determine what happened next, with a chat sidebar discussing the performance in grotesquely technical terms. I forced myself to watch 3 more videos, each featuring different victims in the same room, each following a similar pattern of escalating violence directed by remote bidders. In the background of one, a distinctively shaped light fixture was visible, identical to the designer installations in Neurosync's executive conference room. These horrors weren't happening in some distant location. They were occurring inside our building, possibly on the sealed executive floor above the main workspace. The sickening realization crystallized all at once. The true product of Neurosync wasn't neural interface technology. That was merely the public-facing operation that provided cover and funding for their actual business. A sophisticated dark web platform streaming interactive torture and murder to paying clients worldwide. The enormous server capacity, the odd hours network activity, the excessive security measures, all of it supported this nightmare hidden beneath the glossy veneer of innovation. I spent the night paralyzed by indecision, oscillating between calling the police immediately and recognizing the depth of evidence I would need to overcome the company's resources and connections. By morning, I'd formulated a plan to gather more concrete proof, to document everything systematically before taking it to authorities. I showered, dressed, and headed to the office as usual, the encrypted drive securely hidden in my apartment. The moment I badged into the building, I knew something was wrong. Security guards I'd never seen before stood by the lifts. My team lead intercepted me before I reached my desk, explaining that Chen wanted to see me immediately about a network security concern they'd detected overnight. As we rode the lift to the executive floor, an area I'd never accessed before, cold dread settled in my stomach. They knew. Chen's office was minimalist and cold, all glass and steel with views across London's skyline. He sat calmly behind a desk that probably cost more than my annual salary, flanked by two men whose stance and watchful eyes suggested backgrounds in something other than software development. With perfect composure, Chen explained that they detected my unauthorized server access, my file download, my violation of the confidentiality agreements I'd signed. He spoke of disappointment rather than anger, of necessary consequences for betrayal of trust. What followed was a proposal so casual in its monstrousness that I briefly wondered if I was hallucinating. Chen explained that NeuroSync's public business was merely a developmental phase. The real innovation lay in what he called experiential content, pushing the boundaries of human experience through unfiltered reality broadcast to select audiences. The neural interface technology wasn't separate from this. It was its ultimate evolution, creating direct sensory connections between paying clients and unwilling subjects. My technical skills made me valuable enough to offer a choice: join their inner operation with substantially increased compensation, or become content for it. As he outlined these options, a screen on his wall displayed a live feed of my flat, of the encrypted drive's hiding place, of my parents' home in Manchester. The message was clear. They controlled every aspect of my reality. I'd like to say I took the moral high ground, that I refused outright and accepted the consequences. The truth is more complicated and shameful. I hesitated. For 17 excruciating seconds, I actually considered the offer, mentally calculating survival probabilities, wondering if I could gather evidence from the inside, telling myself noble lies about infiltration and justice. Chen watched this internal struggle with clinical interest, as if my ethical crisis was itself a form of entertainment. What saved me wasn't courage, but circumstance. A notification on Chen's computer diverted his attention momentarily. Some issue with their broadcast server requiring immediate resolution. He instructed one of his associates to escort me to a holding room until he could continue our conversation. As we moved through a minimalist corridor, a building-wide power fluctuation caused the lights to dim briefly. My escort instinctively checked his earpiece communication, creating a momentary distraction. I ran, through a fire exit, down emergency stairs, triggering alarms that actually worked in my favor by creating confusion. I emerged into Shoreditch's late morning bustle and didn't stop running until I reached Liverpool Street Station, losing myself in the commuter crowd. I abandoned my phone, my laptop, every device that could be traced, and used a stranger's mobile to call the one person I trusted absolutely, my former cybersecurity professor who had government connections. The investigation that followed moved with agonizing slowness, hampered by NeuroSync's political influence and technological countermeasures. By the time authorities gathered enough evidence for action, the primary servers had been wiped clean. Key executives had disappeared overseas, and Chen himself had vanished completely. They found the broadcasting studio hidden behind biometric locks on the executive floor, forensic evidence confirming what had happened there. But the victims remained unidentified, their digital ghosts haunting encrypted channels beyond conventional reach. 3 years later, I live under a different name in a different country, working IT for a small manufacturing firm that still uses physical paperwork for sensitive information. I've testified in closed hearings, signed countless governmental secrecy agreements, and spent hundreds of hours in therapy trying to reconstruct a sense of normalcy. Sometimes I almost succeed. But late at night, when sleep evades me, I remember Chen's expression as he outlined my options, not malicious or sadistic, but genuinely curious, as if my moral anguish was simply another form of data to collect. And I wonder how many other brilliant startups with charismatic founders and revolutionary promises are hiding similar horrors behind their sleek interfaces and inspirational mission statements, offering technological salvation with one hand while recording our most private moments with the other, transforming human suffering into content for those wealthy and depraved enough to consume it. The most terrifying realization isn't that monsters exist. It's that they wear wireless earbuds, quote philosophers on Instagram, and raise billions in venture capital, and that we willingly invite them into every aspect of our lives, mesmerized by the promise of a better, more connected future, while they quietly claim terminal access to our humanity.